Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We will get started in just a few minutes. If you'd like, why don't you go ahead and put in the chat where you're dialing in from. And as you're putting all the notes in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, why this topic and why you're here today? Before we get started, we do have a poll, and the first question is, what industry do you represent?
I do think there's a question, if we can enable the chat.
All right, so thanks everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Katrina Holland, the Executive Director for MedTech Color, and today's topic is Equity in Action, Redefining Clinical Trials Through Inclusive Research. Today we'll hear from several experts in this space who will provide their advice on how to implement strategies that improve health outcomes by ensuring an inclusive approach to research design. MedTech Color is committed to ensuring health equity for all. We provide a platform to advance thought leadership that's critical to healthcare integrity. MedTech Color membership offers an opportunity for leaders of color and our allies in MedTech to connect, engage, and thrive in our industry's continuous need for diverse individuals to be involved in the design of medical innovations. Our community focuses on coming together to explore ways to advance representation and amplify the experience and expertise of people of color in our industry. Representation matters. Diversity of thought helps us to cover our blind spots, to find common ground, and to ensure that the future of healthcare meets the needs of all patients. Apply today to be a professional or young professional member. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and we also have staff behind the scenes running the technical portion of the program. They will be monitoring questions and troubleshooting as the program proceeds. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our moderator for today's session, Dr. Candace Carpenter. Dr. Candace Carpenter is the co-founder and the co-CEO and CSO of the Boston Public Congress for Public Health. She serves as a co-editor-in-chief of the Boston Congress of Public Health Review and the chair of MedTech Color's Education Planning Committee. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Candace Carpenter.
All right, thank you so much for that, Katrina. I'm so happy to be here with all of you for this Equity in Action webinar. I know that I joined as a member of MedTech Color a few months ago, and I know I was just absolutely thrilled when I went to a live pitch session in Los Angeles. So I'm hoping that many of you will also join as members if you haven't already. It's been a wonderful experience learning more about the MedTech community. I know I was part of the UCLA Biodesign and UCLA Venture Accelerator for over a year before starting Medflix, which Katrina didn't mention, which is a medtech company that I've been working on alongside the Boston Congress of Public Health as well. But I'm very excited to bring a number of different panelists for you today, a lot of diversity in this panel for sure. I will briefly introduce them and then I'll allow them to introduce themselves more because I can never steal the thunder of these awesome panelists. First, we have Brittany Gerald Lewis. She's the Associate Director of Clinical Trials and Health Equity at Moderna, where she leads clinical trial diversity efforts for infectious and latent disease trials. Everyone, please welcome Brittany. All right. Next, we have Dr. Maria Restrepo. She is Diversity and Clinical Trials Program Director at Moderna. She leads the company's efforts to ensure diverse patient representation. Maria, thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, we have Dr. Nadine Spring, one of my closer colleagues who I've worked with before as well. She's Assistant Professor of Public Health and the owner of Springwell 360 LLC, a firm dedicated to addressing health equity. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Spring. All right, and before we kick off the questions for this panel, I wanted to set the stage by saying a little bit more about why we're doing equity and inclusion. And in the realm of healthcare, as many of the other areas we've seen as well, the urgency of addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials and other ways is never more apparent. As clinical research continues to shape the future of medicine, it's critical that trials really reflect those diverse populations that they aim to serve. Historically, as many of you know, marginalized communities have been underrepresented in clinical trials, leading to gaps in understanding how those treatments can really impact various demographic groups. This inequity can perpetuate disparities in healthcare outcomes and truly undermine the effectiveness of new therapies. In our Equity in Action and Clinical Trials webinar, we're seeking to explore those importance of fostering diversity in clinical research and highlight some of those strategies for ensuring inclusive representation and participation and addressing those systemic barriers that have excluded various groups. And as we confront the urgent need for more representative data, this conversation is essential in building a healthcare system that is truly equitable for all. So once again, feel free to put your questions in the chat as well as in the Q&A. And I think we'll just double check to make sure that chat is in fact enabled for all of you. But I wanted to go ahead and have the panelists tell us a little bit more about themselves. And then let's get a little bit more personal as well. Tell us one of your superpowers. And we'll start with Brittany Gerald Lewis.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Brittany Gerald Lewis. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black female with curly brown hair, wearing a blue top, and I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. I say my superpower is I'm a great problem solver. It may not seem like a great superpower, but in any instance, I can. And that's what also ties into my why of why I love this topic. My father has a number of chronic health conditions on many different medications. And early in my career as a CRA, I saw that many patients in the trials didn't look like him. And, we have to remember there's people who take these medicines depending on their indication for decades of their life. And so that's why it's really important we have better data, more inclusive data on medicines, because that's, really who it's for at the end of the day is patients. And I really just think it's a responsibility for, pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, especially in this climate, just to continue the race, because like everyone says, the one monkey doesn't stop a show. So the show will continue. I'm just really honored to be a part of this conversation and just continue the fight for more inclusive clinical research.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brittany. Maria, we'll go ahead and jump to you.
Yes, absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. As Brittany and you, Candice, mentioned, like this, very important to have this discussion here today, especially, right now with everything that's going on. I'm a Latina woman joining from Boston today. I'm wearing a green top with a black blazer. I'm part of Medtronic, the leader in healthcare technology, which treats over 70 conditions. But more importantly, we improve lives of 2 patients every second. And in my role, I get the privilege to come to work every day to lead Medtronic's efforts to ensure that our clinical trials include the patients that represent those impacted by the conditions that we're treating. It's a privilege to be able to do this work every day. And one of my superpowers, because of course I have many, but one of them is the ability to simplify complexity. And I leverage this superpower in ensuring that we have actionable measures to increase diverse enrollment across the organization.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Maria. And yes, I think simplifying complexity will definitely come into play as we're talking about, a very urgent topic today. Dr. Nadine Spring would love to hear more about your background as well as your superpower.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Nadine Spring. I am also in Atlanta, Georgia. My pronouns are she and hers. I am wearing a striped blue and white dress, and my hair is black or dark brown, and it's straight today. And so my superpower is perseverance. I grew up in New York City, and I am really deeply connected to advancing diversity in clinical trials. When I went to college, I had no idea I was going to end up working in clinical research. Clinical research was nowhere on my radar. I and I ended up in research by accident, actually. I graduated with biology and I was like, well, what am I going to do with this undergrad in biology? I started working as a research assistant at Mount Sinai Medical Center. Then I became a research coordinator. Then I became a research manager. And eventually I moved to, Georgia, where I became director of clinical trials, all along pursuing degrees along the way, master's in clinical research and MPH, and eventually a doctorate, PhD in public health. And for 6 years, I was on the front lines working with patients who were living with lupus every day. And these are individuals from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, and they struggled with the burdens of this chronic, condition. And when I looked at the clinical trials, being conducted at the same institutions, I saw a contrast. The participants in the trials, they were largely a very homogeneous group. And this is not just lupus clinical trials. They were like trials everywhere. Like they're a very homogeneous group. They weren't very diverse. And they were not really representative of the communities living day to day with the conditions, the people who I interacted with every single day. And I know, Dr. Carpenter, you heard this story before, so I'm going to repeat it. I'm sorry. So what I realized were like the people who I saw every day, they really weren't benefiting from gaining access to cutting edge, new therapies. So they were literally being left behind and left out of research that could literally change their lives and improve the quality of their life. So to answer your question, what is my superpower? That's literally the unwavering drive to push forward. That's why I started my company, Springwell 360, to push forward despite the challenges. Because when we have a lot of mistrust, and rightfully so because of historical injustices, you have so much that we need to do. There's so many factors that we need to work on to diversify clinical trials, to push for health equity. This means tirelessly advocating and persevering, advocating for underrepresented communities, breaking down a lot of systemic barriers and ensuring that there is equitable access to reach, and have opportunities for all of these communities. So my superpower is really perseverance.
Wonderful. So thank you to the panelists for your introductions. And so once I said this before, love the diversity, Moderna, Medtronic, and, your own company, Dr. Spring. Wonderful representation in terms of different areas. I wanted to ask a question that I actually hadn't pre-planned. So there may be people on this call who don't necessarily know what diversifying clinical trials actually means. And I think people may have a knee-jerk reaction of what that may mean, especially in this political climate. But for each of you, if you could define what exactly does that mean, we're talking about diversifying clinical trials, which populations are we talking about? So I'll go ahead and start with you, Dr. Spring, and then Maria, and then Brittany. We'll change up the order here.
So for me, it means everyone. It means women. It means Black women. It means Native Americans, Hispanics. It means everyone. If you exist, it means we want you in a clinical trial. Because at the end of the day, we need to know when something's approved that it's safe and effective for everyone that's going to have access to it, for everyone that it's going to be prescribed for.
Yeah, and I would echo that same commentary that Nadine did, but I would emphasize that we want to make sure that with diversity in clinical trials, we mean that the patients that need to be enrolled in our clinical trials need to represent those that are impacted by the disease, the specific condition that we're treating, and that makeup can be very different if it's a product that it's intended to treat hypertension versus if it's something intended to treat a colon cancer. And so like understanding like what is the incidence and prevalence of those specific conditions will really define who needs to be taking part in the clinical trials that are assessing those different products.
Yeah, completely agree with Maria. And that's the main thing is like we have representation for those that have the highest disease burden. So that may be depending on the indication, could be pediatrics, could be older adults, could be women. So we want to make sure that we're really representative of who has the unmet need or the highest disease burden and make sure that they're represented in trials so that when a medicine is approved, we know it's going towards populations that really need the treatment.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I love that collective definition that we have there, right? So not only from Dr. Spring in terms of thinking about everyone, but then also Maria and Brittany thinking about like those that it is specifically indicated for, right? Who has the highest prevalence of that particular disease. And moving on to the next question. So what specific strategies have each of you taken in overcoming enrollment barriers for different unrepresented populations that we mentioned before? And feel free to just hop in.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is we hear a lot about study design and a lot of protocols are copy paste. So protocol is basically the instructions of how a trial is run. And when you're looking at inclusion or exclusion criteria, which is basically what allows someone to be in a trial versus not qualifying, it's really looking at do we have some bias that's already in there? A lot of trials would have BMI, but BMI doesn't really tell us anything. It doesn't mean you're healthy, unhealthy. So really looking at what are some scenarios where it's not really tied to the outcome of the trial or the need that we can kind of take out. So I think for us is really looking at, when we're writing studies, are we really being inclusive, during the trial? Even study designs, do we need, this many study visits, knowing that that could be a barrier? Is there something we could maybe do virtually or something that the, patient could do a lab at home or somewhere else and send in? So really looking at, when we're presenting a trial, does it actually make sense or are we just, excluding people just unnecessarily when we really haven't thought about it?
Yeah, and I would add that, I mean, echoing Brittany's comments, like it's necessary to make sure that we look at diversity in clinical trials, not in the execution phase only, but really throughout the study life cycle. So when the moment that we start thinking about generating evidence, that's when we need to bring the diversity lens into the process. And it's things like, for example, like who are collaborating with, like who are the KOLs that the key opinion leaders that we're engaging with in the process. Are they bringing a diversity perspective into it? Things like the study design, what Brittany was mentioning. And I can provide an example, a success story that we've had within our organization, which is the SMART trial, which was a clinical trial that was set to understand how the most used transcatheter aortic valve replacement systems or TAVRs perform, like ours and our competitors. And we were looking specifically into small aortic annuli. And so this SMART trial was the largest randomized controlled TAVR trial to enroll primarily women. The team was able to achieve an 80%, 87% female enrollment, which compared to the historical numbers that we got for this trial, they were like 31 to 45%. So there was this huge increase, and the team was able to accomplish this by really being inclusive throughout the study life cycle. So engaging with diverse KOLs from the start, ensuring that the study was designed in such a way that it enabled that a female enrollment, and very importantly, deploying tactics in the execution that further enable that, like partnering closely with the sites in bringing diversity to the forefront, and also tactics like, for example, bringing diverse imagery into and how we reach the patient. So it's really the strategy is like being inclusive like throughout the study.
So another approach that I've seen work was meeting the patients where they are. So instead of having the patients come to the site, we went where they were. So we partnered with a church, and I was part of a team where it's a multidisciplinary team that treated these patients, where it's social work, it's cardiologists, it's dermatologists, it's rheumatologists, all treating them. And the church had a health fair. And there we were under a tent on a hot summer day, and we had firefighters giving CPR lessons. And now we had a team of nurses, social workers, all there. And we were there to provide, peer-to-peer sessions, support for people who may know someone with the conditions, brochures. And that's how we got them to come to this hospital. Some people left their previous doctors and said, hey, I have more support at this hospital, even if it means traveling an hour to get there. And they were able to then tell me, my care is better. I receive outcomes are better and after that. So some of these things, strategies are just meeting patients where they are, partnering in churches, health fairs, informing them about clinical trials to raise awareness could be some of the strategies that can be done to help with outcomes for certain conditions.
Yeah. So I love that, many of you guys echoed each other, right? So the life cycle for that clinical trial. So as you were saying, Maria, right, from its inception, the study design, all the way to execution. And then as you were saying, Dr. Spring and Brittany, thinking about meeting patients where they're at as well, and those different types of strategies for them, different types of sites. You also mentioned imagery, Maria. Could you expound upon that just a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, one thing that we have observed is that historically in most of the patient recruitment materials that were used, like the images, something as simple as the images that were used in the materials didn't necessarily reflect a lot of diverse representation. So if you have a patient that is coming from a different background, let's say like a Hispanic or like African American, and they don't see themselves represented in those materials that they're receiving when they're being like educated on the clinical trial or like clinical research, it's going to be more challenging to get that messaging across. And so things as really as simple as just using different images so that more people can see themselves reflected does have an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very curious. So Maria and Brittany, so being at Moderna and Medtronic, if you could describe exactly what is a day in the life for someone who is diversifying clinical trials. Obviously, it may differ, but I'm very curious from your guys' perspectives.
Yeah, and it varies on different indication and the light, where we are in the study, but kind of like Maria said, just kind of stepping into where are we. So if we're early in the study looking at, okay, well, what countries do we need to be in? Thinking about early with the languages, with the imagery we want, even looking at health literacy, if we're going to have, an informed consent, can we have someone review it to make sure that it's at appropriate reading level? It makes sense. Again, with the brochures, with that, of course, meeting with the study team saying, hey, this is our objective with the trial based on, therapeutic area, the age, and just kind of influencing that and just really doing the overall strategy for the trial. And then a great thing we also do is we monitor during the trial, the enrollment, but also the retention. You don't want to include people and enroll people in trials and then they drop out. So also monitoring that they're completing it. If they aren't dropping out, what are the reasons? So we can take that back in lessons learned. So it's really just having a strategy, executing it, and then really learning from it and just continuing to do better each time.
Yeah, and I would add to that a day in my life it also includes a lot of connecting points like across the organization, because as a large organization with over 90,000 employees, we have a lot of different clinical teams like working on very like different studies. And so what we try to do is really like bridge the gap and make sure that we have the right platforms to share those best practices so that we can continue to learn upon that that overall experience. And that's something that it's critical, because you don't want to like reinvent the wheel elsewhere. But if you find that including like certain imagery works here, or like what Brittany was mentioning, like the reading level, it had an impact here, like we want to make sure that we really amplify those efforts that are already working.
Yeah. And Dr. Spring, in your efforts in the past as well, was there anything in particular that a day in the life that may have contrast with what Brittany or Maria mentioned?
Absolutely. First of all, every day could be different, right? But I would say the one thing that strives me to keep going forward is when I see the efforts and the thank yous, and when I see that there is progress being made. And certainly 20 years ago, we all knew this was a problem. We all knew that we needed more diversity in clinical trials. But now that we're seeing conferences are being made around this topics, now that we're seeing certainly platforms like this around this topic, we know that things are being done. We know that the needle is being pushed forward towards health equity. So I'm thankful for organizations like this, MedTech Color. I'm thankful for people like you, Dr. Carpenter, for pushing that needle forward and raising awareness. So this, so certainly there are there sorry, there are similarities in our day-to-days between Brittany and Maria and I, in health equity and diversity in clinical trials, even though we're all working on different ways in moving this needle forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I love to dig a little deeper with a couple different things as well. So I was curious, Maria, you mentioned, and I think Brittany as well, enrollment and retention. And so is there any time period where you pump the brakes and you say, oh, our enrollment, our retention is looking disastrous?
Well, I can start first because Moderna had a famous example of that. Actually, our first phase 3 trial was our COVE trial for COVID-19. And we were, enrolling amazingly. But then as we're getting more surveillance data from the CDC, they really saw that, hey, we're seeing a lot more people of color have more severe reactions and are hospitalized to COVID. And so they really made the, hard decision to really slow enrollment. And we were able to really flip it from, I think at the time it was, maybe over a large majority was, white participants to flipping it to having large, African American, Black, and Hispanic Latinx populations because we saw that's who was being most affected. And so, that's our thing we're most proud of because we actually could have been first to market, but we were not because we made that intentional pause to make sure that we were more representative in our trials. And that's something that we really monitor because, again, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of those that have the highest disease burden. And so we are a little bit better now. We don't have to do it, but that was, a pandemic. So there was a rush, but that's something we really take seriously to make sure that we're really being intentional. And so we won't have to pause the trials in the future. But again, if we need to make sure that we're reaching the patients that need, then that's not something we'll hesitate to do.
Yeah, and for us, like it's also something that we monitor very, very closely as I would say like as a lagging indicator of our efforts in driving diversity in clinical trials. And as we closely monitor, like we do identify those signals where sometimes it may be necessary to double down on the efforts that may be needed to reach certain population. In some cases, like we need to maybe activate sites that are in different locations that can give us access to those diverse population, or deploy some different efforts to make sure that we're reaching them in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love hearing that, so even though Moderna, it sounds like, wanted to be first to market, you still nonetheless took diversity, enrollment and retention efforts very seriously. And then similarly, Maria, as you said, activating a variety of different sites to be able to increase that enrollment as well. I'm curious, we've talked a lot about strategies, but if we segue into any challenges that you have faced in your recent endeavors with diversifying. Love to hear. And how about we start with Dr. Spring and then go back around?
Sure. So I would say one of the challenges I face stems from historical injustices, right? We all know what happened in Tuskegee with the syphilis trials. And this was something that was endorsed by the United States government, where, Black men were withheld treatment for syphilis as experiments were unjustly, conducted on them, right? And they suffered for years. And this was done in the name of medical research. We know that, Dr. Marion Sims conducted research on Black women, and this is how much of what we know in modern gynecology came to be known. We know about Henrietta Lacks, where her cells were taken from her without her consent. And a lot of what, her cells were replicated and replicated. And companies got rich off of replicating her cells and doing research. And a lot of what we know in science came out of the research that were conducted on her cells. And her family never got a dime until I think a settlement was made in 2023 with her family, right? And so a lot of the pushback that I've received from people are based on what they know and the headlines that's been made based on, the historical injustices based on in medical research. So, but we have to inform them that this was the past, and there are practices in place now to prevent this exploitation from happening in the future. But if we continue to not allow ourselves to understand that medical research is here and it's here to help us. We'll continue to not be advance when there are advances in science that can help us. So for instance, for certain conditions that plague our community, whether it's conditions like sickle cell or conditions like hypertension or lupus, these, treatments may continue to evade us if we don't participate in the clinical trials that can help us. So, that's one of the take-home messages I'd like to make sure that our community, understands. But I'm not saying go out there and willy-nilly participate in every single clinical trial that comes our way. Be sure to read the consent form, ask questions, and, by all means, participate if possible. I participate in research studies. I'll give my sample, I'll ask questions, and by all means, it may benefit you, it may not. So that's the take home. But unfortunately, there were some historical injustices that happened, but we do have ethics boards that are around. Another thing that I want to encourage people to know is that IRBs and ethics boards are here, and as members of the community, you can participate and serve on IRBs. And this is one way for you to be involved in research that are benefiting your community. These are ways for you to help your community and choose research that can serve the people in your community. So that's one thing I'd love for people in the community to know.
Yeah, and tying in with that, thank you, Dr. Spring, because we do have those challenges with getting participants into trials, but also connecting it on the industry side. Everyone knows it's the right thing to do. It should be easy, right? But there is still that challenge of we're having to change the ways of working. And for large, massive organizations, those have been doing research for many years, it's a challenge to get them to change and to shift. So really influencing, cross collaboration, people higher up of saying, hey, this is why it's important, why it's needed. And I always lead with, everyone, company says we're for the patients, and think about the patients are going to have to take the medicine. So really just connecting those dots is something to do. But the biggest challenge we really see is just explaining in a business sense why this is important, and not just, we, of course, we know scientifically and morally, ethically is important, but translating that for, C-suites and, investors and shareholders of what that means for the business is a challenge. But again, it's important, so it needs to be done.
I can offer a different challenge that we face from a medical technology sponsor perspective, which is that traditionally we have relied, given the type of like products that we're testing on, like we have relied on specialized centers that have specific procedural expertise. And so this is challenging because it introduces biases in the centers that we may or may not be able to use for our clinical research, and these may not be accessible to all patient populations. And so doing that like outreach through those larger centers can generate some challenges, right? However, we have seen even within our medical technology side of the business, that there are ways to still engage the community at a different scale. And one example of that is the work that Medtronic has been doing in the development and testing with pulse oximeters, making sure that we are inclusive to ensure those equitable outcomes when we use these devices. And so how we have approached this is that we met the community where they are, kind of like what Nadine was talking on, and we were able to locate the lab where we test these devices in a diverse neighborhood in Denver, Colorado, where part of the Medtronic team resides. And we have been able to leverage this co-location and then this diversity within the community to proactively reach out to the community through local events where we get to connect with people and build sustainable relationships, which has been extremely helpful because we have been able to learn from that example at that scale and understand how that could be replicated in the different scenarios where we need to go to larger centers that are very, very different, but it still provides great insights that we can learn from.
Yeah, so very fascinating. So it sounds like a wide variety of different challenges, from those that exist with the patients, right? A sense of historical mistrust, distrust, potential exploitation, maybe not awareness of the ethical review boards, the IRBs that are in place now that may help to significantly decrease that sense of being more vulnerable and engaging in clinical trials. Then from, as what you were mentioning, Brittany, the fact that it's harder for a larger company to change how it's used to working. And then from your perspective, Maria, like the location, right? Like not always having the exact accessibility. I think that's great. And I'm very curious as well, what are some of the ethical issues that you may have confronted that we haven't exactly talked about yet in your roles as diversity leaders at your respective companies?
Okay, well, I'll go. We get a lot, sometimes there's pushback because you'll have people say, well, genetically, we're not all that different. And so then they're like, well, why the need to have diversity for like race and ethnicity? And in some instances, that's correct, but there are some instances where we see there are some differences. We see sickle cell anemia more because for people of African descent, that protects against malaria. We see certain things for Middle East communities and populations that, we see other diseases in just because of, genetically where they are. But on the flip side, kind of going back what Dr. Spring was saying, there have been these, gross negligence in terms of medical treatment and testing on many different populations. And so we're balancing that, hey, there may not be that, biological difference, but we are looking at who's been underrepresented in research, where the health disparities are. So it's really kind of shifting it to, yes, maybe biologically, there's not always so many differences, but what we're seeing in healthcare in the past, present, and future, there are huge disparities, and that needs to be addressed because, everyone is not going to the hospital going to get the same treatment, depending on what they look like, their health insurance, socioeconomic status. So those are all things that need to be considered when making sure we're having, better representation, and specifically when we're looking at, more inclusive research practices.
I would add that one of the things that we have seen in as we have approached the increase of diversity within our clinical trials is that we cannot really assume what are the right solutions for the people that we're trying to serve and the people that we're trying to reach these underserved communities, because we simply just don't know what we don't know. And so how we have approached this is making sure that we, first of all, acknowledge that we all have biases that can influence how we really develop the solutions to address this challenge, but that we need to make sure that we bring in diverse voices to the process to be able to get to the right solution. So, and that comes at many different layers, is ensuring that the team that we work with to develop the infrastructure and the framework to drive this diversity is diverse in itself, so that we can, even if it's a few people, make sure that we all bring a different lens of diversity to bring in that different perspective. But also one approach that we're taking internally is that we have a large workforce within Medtronic, 90,000 employees. Like that's a lot of people that come from very different backgrounds, and it may be time intensive, but we have done the exercise to, when we are coming up with things that can probably help us reach the community in different ways, we have reached to a larger pool of our employees, just because we know that there is that diversity within that we can learn from. And the last layer that I would add there is the importance of listening to our patients, because engaging the patients and engaging a diverse group of patients will provide a lot of different insights on what could be the barriers that we have within our protocols, within our inclusion and exclusion criteria, how we talk about the trial, etc. And that really, the value of having the patient insights is just incredible, and how it helps shape the clinical trials.
I think Brittany and Maria summed it up really great. And I think overall ethical engagement in these clinical trials is really going to be about trust building. It's going to be about transparency and about shared decision making with the patients. And the goal is going to be really to increase participation in these clinical research and empower them to make, the best decisions in their communities and to take an active role in shaping the future for medical research. I think Brittany and Maria just did a really good job summarizing it for, ethical engagement in medical research.
Yeah, absolutely love that. Like empowering the patients, listening to them, wondering what it is that may be stopping them from participating. And I think that dovetails well with a question we have from the chat. Someone is curious about the social determinants of health, how they play a role in clinical research, study design, obviously education, employment, economics, environments, etc.
Yeah, it plays a huge determinant. And I think we are also really being more proactive about understanding the different, again, what everyone is coming to the table with, meaning the patients, where they are. When we're even thinking about, study design, does it make sense to have an 8-hour screening visit when people may not be able to take off 8 hours of work? They may not have PTO, or they only have it limited and they want to go on vacation. We can't make assumptions about people like, okay, well, yes, if they're a mother with children, yeah, they can just come, without thinking about what their childcare needs are, or if they're a caregiver. And so we're really trying to do a better job of, again, getting the patient voice, like Maria said, to understand who is a population and how many differences do they have that we can really address. So even having transportation options for concierge, having, telehealth visits, or just doing compensation. We were on a trial for pediatrics and understanding, people have multiple children. So we had little coloring books and different things for the other kids to maybe play with while their siblings in a visit. So really just thinking about what makes us, different, but also addressing that. And then one more thing I wanted to add with, study design, we're assuming, people can be on certain medications, but if you don't have health insurance or inadequate health insurance, you may not have access to get diagnosed or treatment. So also looking at, a patient's diagnostic and treatment journey and kind of what we can do on our side to help not, exclude those people just based on, their accessibility with healthcare.
To add to what you just said, Brittany, last year I read an article about the NIH wanting to make cancer trials more diverse. And so what they did was they paid for travel expenses. And did it work? No. And I said, well, no, of course it's not going to work. And I'm sure it wasn't going to work, right? And all of us sitting here knew it wouldn't have worked because we know that just paying for travel expenses was not the only thing to make it work because there are so many other things to consider. Like you just mentioned, time off from work, childcare, meals, all of that. And I literally sat there and wondered who they had at the table when they designed that clinical trial, right? And I remembered being at a Black Women in Clinical Research meeting or conference and hearing the Surgeon General saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That was a statement that he made. And I wondered who was at the table when they designed the clinical trial, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that's why it didn't work. So, and I can pop a link to that trial in the chat for, if anyone wants to read it later, on their own time.
And just
Yeah.
really quick to add in, and I will say that's a huge misconception that some people think underrepresented populations, we're not poor, right? Like everyone's not like just throw money at it and that's the case. Like, no, were we asked to be in a trial? Do we really have the education? Do we have the trust? Do we have the opportunity? And so I think that's another challenge to kind of get people's head around, like it's not just throwing money at it and then the problem solved, because we're all different. And even within the same communities, it's not just, oh, everything just needs to be in Spanish and that's going to bring the Hispanic population. It's more than that. And so again, just kind of connecting with everyone, actually talking to patients, getting insight to understand what the barriers are is the only way we're really going to make actionable, measurable results and that are really more inclusive and getting more participation.
Yeah, something that we have tried to really hone in within our teams internally is that there is no silver bullet to like fix diversity in clinical trials, but it is a combination of a lot of different actions at many different places within the clinical study that will get us there. So it's not throwing money at it. It's not just giving compensation for transportation, but you need to look at it like from so many different angles and address everything proportionally so that you're able to get there.
Yeah, I think that's such a wonderful insight. And I think that was resonating with the audience as well, right? That diverse communities, historically marginalized, underserved communities are heterogeneous, right? They're not monolithic. They have different needs. It's not just a matter of financial compensation. It's just not a matter of transportation or language, right? There are a number of different angles, as you all mentioned. We have another question as well. I've heard some examples, but there are additional medical devices, especially legacy devices, that stand out as strong examples of health equity in action. Could you share the variety of cases that illustrate how manufacturers have successfully ensured equitable safety, effectiveness, and accessibility across diverse patient populations?
I can provide an example that I think it's extremely relevant right now, which is the pulse oximeters. And I know that I spoke about some of the work that we've done with the local community in Denver, Colorado. But pulse oximeters are I don't know, all medical products are essential, but I think that pulse oximeters are so commonly used and necessary for like so many different interactions that we have with the healthcare system, that when during the pandemic, like it became evident that there was an issue with how these devices performed in different skin pigmentations. Like that was something that was clearly alarming, that needed to be addressed. And that's something that not only Medtronic as a medical technology organization, but the regulators and many different organizations have come together to make sure that we have the right processes and guardrails in place to ensure that these devices are safe and effective across the board. And I mean, within Medtronic, like we've done a lot of work to ensure that we are testing with the right patients, that we're including the right like skin colors within the testing and the development of all these products, just to make sure that we are contributing towards equitable health outcomes, having devices that work for everyone.
Yeah, wonderful. I think, and someone said this in the chat as well, right? Because we, I think, have mostly been thinking about pharma and the taking medications, but then, as you were saying, right, obviously this is med tech color, so we think a lot about devices, with MTC as well. Is there a difference in terms of the protocol, study design, execution for medical devices, pharma, one part, or the types of communities that you're bringing in? So I know we've talked a lot about race and ethnicity, but thinking about communities from disabled communities or LGBTQ communities, what about those, any particular types of strategies for them?
So I mean, I think that when we think about diversity, we do need to think about like all those different aspects to it. Probably at this point, and yeah, like pharma and like medical devices, like we're working towards addressing this challenge in the lack of diversity in clinical trials, and we may be at different points within the progress that we've made. And even though there are a lot of like similarities, there are also many differences in how we approach it. I mentioned the site selection being one of the big, I don't know, challenges that we have, given like the sites that we need to work with, but also just thinking about like sample sizes, like how many patients need to be enrolled in a pharma trial versus in a medical device trial. It's very different. So when you're thinking about diversity, it's with the smaller sample sizes that we have within the medical device trials, that means that we have some different challenges. And so like when we add the layers of diversity, like race and ethnicity and sex, like that's one layer, but then like adding like all those other layers, like it increases the complexity. So yes, we're definitely looking into it. It's just that we need to address it kind of like on a step-by-step basis. Yeah, that's what I would say for that specifically.
Yeah, just echoing her sentiment. And even, thinking about, we talk about sample size. Yeah, one of our RSV trials was 30,000 participants worldwide. I don't think you have 30,000 participants in a medical device trial. But, it's great because we can work together with the different, industries and kind of lessons learned. And kind of we can support them with kind of what we've learned, and they can kind of help us think about things too, because, it'd be great if, we could say, hey, we've done this trial in this place, and hey, there's a new whatever surgical site or something that we can just kind of help share the knowledge of getting more, sites in your network as well. So I think, we do things a little bit differently, but we can definitely come together to work towards, the common goal.
And that's an interesting point, talking about collaboration and working together. Is there cross-industry collaborations that are, sanctioned? Are there national standards, international standards? I don't know if we've mentioned that as much before, but I think we've been having a conversation in terms of like company specific. But do Moderna and Medtronic, do they talk to each other? I'm very curious from your guys' perspective. And then obviously, Dr. Spring, any companies that you work for as well.
Yeah, we don't, unfortunately, outside of this lovely panel. But I will say one thing we are starting to see is just even digital health devices, in trials. I think about like diabetic trials and having like glucose monitors and things like that. And so you will kind of see that collaboration then, but it will kind of be more, therapeutically aligned. But I think outside of that, it's just kind of few and far between. We're, unfortunately, separated, but, any chance we can work together, I think it's important, that we do.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and also that more and more I see more platforms in which we can engage across industries, but also with our own peers in the medical device industry to continue amplifying the lessons learned and the best practices. I think that that's absolutely key. Like things like this panel is essential for us to continue moving forward.
Awesome. Absolutely. And there's a few questions coming in, so keep them coming. We do have about 10 minutes left in the webinar, but we'd love to get as many as we can. And so the next question, I know we've talked about different types of patients, right? Race, ethnicity, disabilities, LGBTQ, but there is a question about enrolling rural communities as well.
Yeah, and that's a big target for us, especially when you're thinking about, underrepresented populations like your Native Americans. And so that's something that we really try to target and actually speak to those in rural areas, because it's not only for clinical trials, but also bringing healthcare out. You're in some towns where the nearest hospital may be, 3 hours, but if there's a clinical research site there, that gives them the opportunity to have, more attention or time with a healthcare provider, kind of as Dr. Spring says, sometimes they get, better care and, research study than in typical, care. So that's a big thing for us, is to make sure that we're actually taking the step to go out and engage with, newer sites or sites that maybe haven't worked with Moderna before, to make sure we're being inclusive, to have that diverse thought, not just urban academic centers, but more inclusive, research centers, to get better access to more populations that maybe wouldn't have access to be in a trial otherwise.
Yeah, I would add to that it's what we have done is on one end, like that's where the patient input is so critical, because you can design a protocol with like X number of visits, etc. But like until you're running by patients, like you're not gonna know like how that would actually be received on the other end. But what we've seen is that sometimes the requirements that we may have on the protocols could be very demanding for those patients that live far from the research sites that or the sites that we're working with. So if it is, I don't know, if we're requiring them to come every 2 to 3 months, like that would be too much. But maybe if you adapt the protocol to something that's every 6 months, then that would make it more feasible for them to participate. So that's on one end, like the patient input on the protocol design. And then the second one is how can we use those decentralized tools to be able to reach the patients where they are, instead of just going on with the traditional clinical trial execution of like patients having to go to the site. So it's about like understanding the challenges and really exploring what tools we have available to bridge the gap.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask, I mentioned earlier about serving on IRBs as one ways people in the community can contribute, as well as serving on CABs, which are community advisory boards. Maria and Brittany, do you guys know if there are opportunities to serve as scientific advisory boards, or as you just mentioned for patients to help contribute to the protocols? Like, do you know if there are opportunities for patients? Like, how do patients get involved to serve on to help contribute to the protocols?
Yeah, and I know you see a lot in rare disease in oncology as well, like patient advisory boards to help with protocol development.
Right.
But outside of that, we've actually had patient insights exercises where we've just kind of done like a advertisement to getting patients. We did this for our maternal RSV study, and we got, either pregnant women or postpartum women from about 6 different countries to kind of give us early insights on the protocol. And so, but that does bring up a good point. Like when we do have those opportunities, how well are we advertising for that to have? And I think also moving forward, if we do want to get more community engagement, it is important to have those conversations. So it's not only transaction when we have a trial, but also, hey, do you know about your disease state, or do you know about why vaccinations is important? And so I think, there are opportunities we can do a better job about just advertising more and just really making sure that we use those patient insights opportunities in more of our trials.
I think that's wonderful, the patient insights, and you said the patient advisory boards. I know there's a question, and I think we would be remiss if we did not discuss AI and the things that you do, right, and its ability to, at least from what those of us, on the sidelines, right, of all of this work, to extremely accelerate, your clinical trial studies. But how is it being used? Moderna, Medtronic, and other places. Is it in fact equitable, or how are you guys measuring the equity if you are using AI?
I love the AI question. AI is only as good as the data. And if you work in clinical research, that is the biggest limiting factor. We don't have enough data on everyone. It's not always the cleanest data. It's not really standardized. And so, we see more in maybe early discovery when they're just kind of thinking about different compounds. But when you're kind of moving towards a little bit later, it's not necessarily the best tool for kind of where we are. Now, if we get better data, more standardized, it's even, challenging because if we're talking about globally, every country doesn't collect the same data. And so that's kind of been the limiting factor for us of really implementing it. But there are other ways that we can use AI. But in terms of like clinical trials, I think we're a few years away of it being, really robust enough for us to really get some meaningful insights from it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that there are opportunities to leverage AI in clinical research that could be beneficial for the industry and maybe not harmful with like the potential biases that may have in things like, for example, like protocol development and things like that on the back end. But yeah, as Brittany mentioned, like it's only as good as the data that goes in, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Switching gears. So another question we have. So the FDA has urged sponsors to establish enrollment goals. How can these goals be realistically set with certain patient populations that might remain underdiagnosed?
Yeah, and that's a big challenge. At Moderna, we try to do it based on kind of country level. And so understanding the differences of the country, what we have access to, what we don't, where the highest disease burden. So again, using epidemiology data, real world evidence. But again, inherently, we know that it's not a lot. Like, for example, a lot of data we get from, EMR systems or majority like Epic and maybe one other. But if your healthcare provider is not using that EMR, then you're kind of being left out. Or if you're underinsured, you're being left out. So we do kind of, again, have to take all the pieces together and also make an educated guess like, hey, we're getting this data, but we still know we see prevalence in this community. So let's just make sure that we are more inclusive with that community as well. So it's kind of taking all the different pieces together and coming up with a recipe that, you do the best that you can guess for an, representative enrollment.
And I think that on that, it's incidence and prevalence is definitely a starting point. But if it's important to take into consideration like all the other potential factors that can impact the different like populations that when you're looking at certain disease or condition, and taking into consideration like any comorbidities, any any social determinants of health, like into the assessment of your enrollment goals will be key, because as you, as the question mentioned, like those things may be underdiagnosed. So there are a lot of like different factors that need to be taken into account.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking, so maybe one additional question that I think may be very relevant for many of the people on the call. So there may be people who are looking to get into clinical trials research to help diversify themselves. What advice would you give to individuals looking to do this kind of work?
Well, I would say, the biggest thing is, stay informed, stay educated. This is a wildly evolving industry, as we all see, but we need more people. So also look at different opportunities that you can contribute. We talk a lot about community engagement, but I really think that's really important in terms of educating communities on clinical research, just even on just their disease state and healthcare in general. So I always say just also be creative in ways that you can really make impact into the community. It may not be an official role or official title, but there's many different ways you can contribute. Even just having ideas. I love the Q&A session because we get ideas where, hey, maybe we haven't thought about that, or hey, we're getting this question a lot. Let's really look how we need to address it. So, any way you can contribute, I think just the overall, just, improving patient health outcomes, I think is going to be really key.
One of the things I would say is that this is a career where you can go in so many different directions. In clinical research, you can go into clinical research accounting, you can go into health equity, you can go into contracting, you can go into, there's so many different pathways you can go into clinical research with. You can go into epidemiology, patient outcomes. There's, community health. There's so many different ways you can do if you go into clinical research. And like Brittany says, you can go into advocacy, right? There's so many things you can do, and it's rewarding there, and just stay informed, and you can reach out to us, and just yeah, just that's just one thing I would say to you if you want to get into this line of work. Keep your
I,
eyes open.
I would echo your comments, Nadine. Like, I think that diversity is everywhere now. So it doesn't matter where you end up in the clinical research process, from like the sponsor, the site, like the community engagement, like diversity is front and center now. So we can all contribute in different ways across the board.
Wonderful. So I want to just say a collective round of applause to all of our panelists. I think this has been an excellent panel. We've learned so much about diversifying clinical trials, right, from study design to execution, paying attention to the social determinants of health, making sure that we think about the subpopulations as heterogeneous, and having diverse strategies, right, to being able to reach them. I want to turn it back over to the CEO of MTC, Katrina, for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Nadine, for a fabulous, fabulous panel. Thank you to everyone who attended. I hope you found this panel insightful. We look forward to seeing you at our next panel, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.
Thank you all.